Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. My name is Rory. You're watching Varietal Literature's YouTube page. We're also a web page, varietal-literature.ca, where you can read short stories and original content, including poems and nonfiction and fiction, from Vancouver writers like myself. Today, we are going to continue to have fun with narrative, but instead, this time, we are going to be reading stories from the past, in this case, Serbian folktales and fairy tales. And if you've never been to the show before, I'm just going to let you know up front that down in the description you can find, if you're not watching this live, you can find timestamps for each of the stories we read. We will read 3 today, for example. And if one interests you more than another, you can just click that and it'll get you to the start of the story. For example, if you clicked on this to find out why you might not want to upset a moustachioed man, you can click on the timestamp for that and skip, my rambling and introductions if that's how you prefer to watch. And just as a note, this is a fairly relaxed, chill stream. And what that means is it works as a background thing if you want to put it on after a long day or lie down on the couch or cook in your kitchen and have it running, and there's nothing visually you're going to miss too much of unless you prefer to read along with the stories with me. But that's what you can look forward to. A little bit of a crackling fireplace, some soft music. If you choose to, you can join in the chat. We can discuss some of the stories together a bit. That's fun, but not everyone likes to do that. But beyond that, welcome to my cabin. Tonight we are reading from a book called Serbian Fairytales, which is a book by E.L. Mijodovic from 1918. So that would put us right sort of in the middle of World War I, which is notable because Serbia had a tough time during World War I, and it was... well, I'm not going to get into it, but there was a lot of connections between Serbia and World War I. So, one thing that's a little odd about Serbia and telling tales from Serbia is trying to really track which culture exactly is being represented, because Serbia, like many areas in southeastern Europe, was a country that, for better or worse, was torn at a lot by larger off-border countries who wanted a piece of it. For example, the Ottoman Empire. And in that time, and just through the natural mixing of history, a lot of different cultures have been called Serbia home. Some in a friendly way and some in a more forceful way. And so consequently, it is interesting to try and figure out exactly what is represented in a collection of Serbian fairy tales and folk tales. I will say that if you go way back, I believe Serbia was Celtic, but that's really far back. It is also marked out as a one of the places that is with the Eastern Orthodox Church, which came from a split in the 13th century with the Roman Catholic Church. So as a result, we will see a lot of Christianization, which had happened in Serbia around the 9th century. We'll see a lot of Christianization in these stories, but that's not necessarily informative of what cultures are involved. It does speak a little bit, though, because during their time with the Ottoman Empire, there was a lot of Islam as the state religion and so on going on, so that it is explicitly a Christian tales that we're going to read today is probably significant as well. All of that is not to say anything one way or another about any of that. That's not really what I do. It is to give you a little bit of context, because when we read, for example, Swedish fairy tales or Norwegian, we do pretty clearly understand that a lot of that, while it is affected by people that come through, a lot of that really boils down to Nordic mythology. And while it is a fairly multifaceted mythology, it also has monolithic things to it. On the other hand, Serbia is a little more complex. So we will be looking at 3 different types of stories here that are offered. And if you've watched this channel before, I think you'll recognize that they belong to what is essentially the 3 different types of tales that we see. Hey, Big Drew. Good to see you. He says, Rory, GS, I'm here. Happy Tuesday night by the fireside. I'm glad to see you're coming in for these. You don't have to keep coming if they're not your thing. Obviously, it is quiet storytelling. But if you enjoy it, I'm glad. So, switching gears a bit here, just about what we're going to go through tonight, why the 3 stories we picked. After doing this for about a year, and so many of you being along with me for that full year, you know, we're a small crowd, but we're a faithful crowd. Or not faithful, loyal. I think you'll probably agree with me that there is kind of 3 different types of folk fairy tales that come up. There's the classic, what I'll call like Disney fairy tale. It's the only ones I really think of as true fairy tales. They involve magic. They're barely explained magic worlds. Like, they're not very well developed. They just kind of say things like, of course the magic apple could cure this. And you're like, well, that was never established. But those kind of fairy tales usually have rhymes that are repeated throughout. They have a very specific moral for children. And they tend to basically use the same stock characters of some prince and princess. Usually the prince saving the princess, though you also get things like the Swedish story that we read about the werewolf, where the princess saves the prince. You know, you get these kind of standard forms that you see, as I say, from Disney. The second style of story, though, and the third style of story don't get as much popular representation because they're not really meant for kids. Not that they're bad for kids or anything. I just think they would be boring to kids. But they are equally common, because I think what we regard fairy tales as like children's stories, but folk tales are just stories you tell people about your region, things you've heard. It's practically gossip at times, which is really what the second type of story is. The second type of story is they don't really have a moral. They don't tend to have clear beginning, middle, and end. Their conclusions tend to be abrupt. And they're really what I would call like a legend, or when I say folktale, that's what I tend to think of. Because a lot of the time they're about real people, just in this sort of aggrandized way. Folktales tend to just be impressive things a person did. It isn't even necessarily good things. Like, there's a story I didn't read, but there's an Irish tale about O'Shaun that we read a little bit of, but it carries on to talk about how he just hunted a forest dry of all life to catch one thing, and then just threw the rest away. Like, that's sort of a feat of strength and mastery of hunting, not necessarily a morally good position to be in. That's what, like, folktales tend to do. Hey, look. Cyrillic too, because we're doing somewhere that would have Cyrillic language, I believe, anyways. For those who are watching later, there's spam in the chat. So, unwanted content or spam. Let's go ahead and report you. The third type of story are stories that are surprisingly rich, character-driven, and have a clear beginning, middle, and end, and frankly, could be on TV. And we're going to see all three of those types. The Disney fairy tale type, the sort of aimless legend folktale type, and the final type, which is an actually fairly rich story. And the first story we're going to look at is a tale of, is like a folktale, is a legend of a guy who does a silly thing, a few silly things. And it is the namesake of the video, so if you're here to watch for that reason, you want to know what the mustache thing is about, this is the story. This story has one of the greatest opening lines I've ever seen in a story, especially for how little explanation it offers. It just lays it before you, and it's not even the weirdest thing in the story. So this story is, again, from the Serbian Fairytales book from 1918, and it's called The Bear's Son, and it is a folk tale. Once upon a time, a bear married a woman, and they had one son. When the boy was yet a little fellow, he begged very hard to be allowed to leave the bear's cave and to go out into the world to see what was in it. His father, the bear, however, would not consent to this, saying, "You are too young yet, and not strong enough. In the world there are multitudes of wicked beasts called men who will kill you." So the boy was quieted for a while and remained in the cave. But after some time the boy prayed so earnestly that the bear, his father, would let him go into the world, that the bear brought him into the wood and showed him the beech tree, saying, "If you can pull that beech tree by the roots, I will let you go, but if you cannot, then this is proof that you are still too weak and must remain with me." The boy tried to pull the tree up, but after long trying had to give it up and go home to the cave. Again, some time passed, and he then begged again to be allowed to go into the world, and his father told him, as before, if he could pull up the beech tree, he might go out into the world. This time, the boy pulled up the tree. So the bear consented to let him go first, however, making him cut away the branches from the beech, so that he might use the trunk for a club. The boy now started on his journey, carrying the trunk of the beech over his shoulder. One day, as the bear's son was journeying, he came to a field where he found hundreds of plowmen working for their master. He asked them to give him something to eat, and they told him to wait a bit till their dinner was brought to them, when he should have some. For they said, "Where so many are dining, one mouth more or less matters but little." Whilst they were speaking, there came carts, horses, mules, and asses, all carrying the dinner. But when the meats were spread out, the bear's son declared he could eat all that up by himself. The workmen wondered greatly at his words, not believing it possible that one man could consume as great a quantity of victuals as would satisfy several hundred men. This, however, the bear's son persisted in affirming he could do, and offered a bet with them that he would do this. I wouldn't bet with a half bear. It probably knows what it can eat. He proposed that the stakes should be all the iron of their plowshares and other agricultural implements. To this they assented. Wait, what was he betting? No sooner had they made the wager than he fell upon the provisions, and in a short time consumed the whole. Not a fragment was left. Hereupon the laborers, in accordance with their wager, gave him all the iron in which they possessed, which would have been quite costly for farmers of that era. When the bear's son had collected all the iron, he tore up a young birch tree, twisted it into a band, and tied up the iron into a bundle, which he hung at the end of his staff, and throwing it across his shoulders, trudged off from the astonished and affrighted laborers. And there's a picture of this right here. That's how he's carrying it. I know it's a little small. Okay. Going on a short distance, he arrived at a forge in which a smith was employed making a plowshare. This man he requested to make him a mace with the iron which he was carrying. This the smith undertook to do, but, putting aside half the iron, he made the rest of a small, coarsely finished mace. The bear's son saw at a glance that he had been cheated by this smith. Moreover, he was disgusted at the roughness of the workmanship. He, however, took it and declared his intention of testing it. Then, fastening it to the end of his club and throwing it high in the air above the clouds, he stood still and allowed it to fall on his shoulder. It had no sooner struck him than the mace shivered into fragments, some of which fell on and destroyed the forge. Taking up his staff, the bear's son reproached the smith for his dishonesty and killed him on the spot. Oof. Having collected the whole of the iron, the bear's son went to another smithy and desired the smith whom he found there to make him a mace, saying to him, "Please play no tricks on me. I bring you these fragments of iron for you to use in making a mace. Beware that you do not attempt to cheat me as I was cheated before." As the smith had heard what had happened to the other one, he collected his workpeople, threw all the iron on his fire, and welded the whole together to make a large mace of perfect workmanship. When it was fastened on the head of his club, the bear's son, to prove it, threw it up high and caught it on his back. This time the mace did not break, but rebounded. Then the bear's son got up and said, "This work is well done," and putting it on his shoulder, walked away. A little farther on he came to a field wherein a man was plowing with 2 oxen, and he went up to him and asked for something to eat. The man said, "I expect every moment my daughter to come with my dinner. Then we shall see what God has given us." The bear's son told him he had eaten up all the dinner prepared for many hundreds of plowmen, and asked, "From what dinner prepared for one person, how much can come to me or to you?" Meanwhile, the girl brought the dinner. The moment she put it down, the bear's son stretched out his hand and began to eat, but the man stopped him. "No," said he, "you must first say grace, as I do." The bear's son, hungry as he was, obeyed, and having said grace, they both began to eat. The bear's son, looking at the girl who brought the dinner, she was a tall, strong, beautiful girl, became very fond of her and said to the father, "Will you give me your daughter for a wife?" The man answered, "I would very gladly give you her, but I have promised her already to the Moustachioed." The bear's son exclaimed, "What do I care for Moustachioed? Have my mace for him." But the man answered, "Hush, hush, Moustachioed is also somebody, and you will see him here soon." Shortly after, a noise was heard afar off, and lo, behind a hill Moustache showed himself, and in it there were 365 birds' nests. In the mustache, if you didn't pick up on that. Shortly after appeared the other Moustache. Then came Moustachioed himself. Having reached them, he lay down on the ground immediately to rest. He put his head on the girl's knee and told her to scratch his head a little. The girl obeyed him, and the bear's son, getting up, struck him with a club over the head. Whereupon Moustachioed, pointing to the place with his finger, said, "Something bit me here." The bear's son struck him with the mace on another spot, and Moustachioed again pointed to the place, saying to the girl, "Something has bitten me here." When he was struck a third time, he said to the girl angrily, "Look you, something bites me here." Then the girl said, "Nothing has bitten you. A man struck you." When Moustachioed heard that, he jumped up, but the bear's son had thrown away his mace and run away. Moustachioed pursued him, and though the bear's son was lighter than he, had gained the start of him a considerable distance, he would not give up pursuing him. At length, the bear's son, in the course of his flight, came to a wide river and found near it some men threshing corn. "Help me, my brothers! Help! For God's sakes!" he cried. "Help! Moustachioed is pursuing me! What shall I do? How can I get across the river?" One of the men stretched out his shovel, saying, "Here, sit down on it, and I will throw you over the river." The bear's son sat on the shovel, and the man threw him over the water to the other shore. Soon after, Moustachioed came up and asked, "Has anyone passed here?" The threshers replied that a man had passed. Moustachioed demanded, "How did he cross the river?" They answered, "He sprang over." Then Moustachioed went back a little to take a start, and with a hop he sprang to the other side and continued to pursue the bear's son. Meanwhile, this last, running hastily up the hill, got very tired. At the top of the hill he found a man sowing, and the sack with seeds was hanging on his neck. After every handful of seeds sown in the ground, the man put a handful in his mouth and ate them. The bear's son shouted to him, "Help, my brother, help! For God's sakes, Moustachioed is following me, and will soon catch me. Hide me somewhere." Then the man said, "Indeed, it is no joke to have Moustachioed pursuing you, but I have nowhere to hide you, unless in this sack amongst the seeds." So he put him in the sack. When Moustachioed came up to the sower, he asked him if he had seen the bear's son anywhere. The man replied, "Yes, he passed by long ago, and God knows where he has got to before this." Then Moustachioed went back again. By and by the sower forgot that the bear's son was in the sack, and he took him out with a handful of seeds and put him in his mouth. The bear's son was afraid of being swallowed, so he looked round the mouth quickly, and seeing a hollow tooth, he hid himself in it. When the sower returned home in the evening, he called to his sisters-in-law, "Children, give me my toothpick. There is something in my broken tooth." The sisters-in-law brought him 2 iron picks, standing one on each side, and they poked about with the 2 picks in his tooth until the bear's son jumped out. Then the man remembered him and said, "Oh, what bad luck you have! I'd nearly swallowed you." After they had taken supper, they talked about many different things, till at last the bear's son asked what happened to break that one tooth, whilst the others were all strong and healthy. Then the man told him in these words, "Once upon a time, 10 of us started with 30 horses to the seashore to buy some salt. We found a girl in the field watching sheep, and she asked us where we were going. We said we were going to the seashore to buy salt. She said, 'Why go so far? I have in the bag in my hand some salt which remained over after feeding the sheep. I think it'll be enough for you.' So we settled about the price, and then she took the salt from her bag. Whilst we took the sacks from the 30 horses, we weighed the salt and filled the sacks with it till all the 30 sacks were full. We then paid the girl and returned home. It was a very fine autumn day, but as we were crossing a high mountain, the sky became very cloudy and it began to snow. There was a cold north wind, so that we could not see our path, and wandered about here and there. At last, by good luck, one of us shouted, 'Here, brothers, here is a dry place.' So we went in one after the other, till we were all, with the 30 horses, under shelter. Then we took the sacks from the horses, made a good fire, and passed the night as if it were a house. Next morning, just think what we saw. We were all in one man's head, which lay in the midst of some vineyards. And whilst we were yet wondering and loading our horses, the keeper of the vineyard came and picked the head up, put it in a sling,
and slinging it about several times, threw it over his head and cast it far away over the vines to frighten the starlings away from his grapes. So we all rolled down a hill, and it was then I broke my tooth.
I think I already know what the comments are going to say, and I see that they are already saying it. Big Drew says dentists would strike gold with cavities big enough to conceal man or beast, but GS says more what I think is probably everybody's issue. I find proportions challenging in this story. Yeah, I don't know. I genuinely do not understand this sort of nesting logic. And I suppose the less you think about it, the better. It's entirely possible that's the point, or it's entirely possible it's like misinterpreted, translated badly. Anyways, there's a legend where, just like I said, it doesn't really, that's the end, if you can believe it. It doesn't really go anywhere exactly. It just kind of is fantastical stories that are sort of woven together, and you never quite know what's going to come next. But it's just sort of creative, entertaining stuff. That's about it. So that's like my second type. Those are folktales, legends. Here's the bear's son and his many adventures through the highlands, or the lowlands or the valleys or whatever else. That's a very common form. The next one we're going to read is actually a more classic fairy tale. More classic fairy tales are focused around getting they will have some sort of somewhat developed sense of magic in it. They have these characters that kind of exist out of place in any specific time, and they seem to be more focused on teaching a lesson. Big Drew says, so the climax and resolution were just left out. Not every story has a climax and resolution. So, one thing I'd like to point out that I've always found interesting is in Western culture, especially, Disney was a big part of this, but Disney's not the only one. Opera had a huge influence on this too. There was a lot of sort of 3-act, big, what's the word I'm looking for here? 3-act, hero's journey kind of stories are so common that sometimes when a story fails to adhere to it, it is brought up as a criticism of it. And I'm not saying that's what you're doing, Drew. I'm just saying that that is something I see very commonly. People say, well, there's no third act or whatever else. It doesn't need a third act. Stories can have 11 acts. They can have 7 acts. I would argue that Clockwork Orange, the original book, not the movie, has 7 acts. I would think the author did as well because he was structuring it after a Shakespeare thing. I would argue that there's a great deal of things what was the name of it? It's a war movie that has 2 acts. Not everything has a climax and a resolution. And I personally, for whatever reason, have always been very charmed by ones that have the confidence to just sort of be like, I'm not trying to teach you anything. I'm just telling you fun stories I've heard, right? The idea of it's almost like gossip. It's almost like the best gossip. I've heard about this guy and he met this person and he did that. And you go, well, what's the moral and theme of that story? And they go, I don't know. We're just having a beer. I'm telling you stories, right? It's that kind of feel. GS says, is it a lesson on mustache teeth sewing? It's not a lesson. It's about somebody who was substantially strong and did fantastical things. This one, however, does have a lesson, does have a theme, and does have a very clear structure. So if you don't like that style of storytelling, you'll like this one more. This is called... Hear me out. This is called Satan's Juggling and God's Might from Serbian Fairytales. One morning, the son of the king went out to hunt. Whilst walking through the snow, he cut himself a little, and the drops of blood fell on the snow. When he saw how pretty the red blood looked on the white snow, he thought, "Oh, if I could only marry a girl as white as snow and as rosy red as this blood." Whilst he was thus thinking, he met an old woman, and asked her if there were such maidens anywhere to be found. The old woman told him that on the mountain he saw before him he would find a house without doors. And the only entrance and outlet of this house was a single window. And, she added, "In that house, my son, there is living a girl such as you desire. But of the young men who have gone to ask her to be their wife, none have returned." "That may be all as you say," answered the prince, "but I will go nevertheless. Only tell me the way that I must take to get to the house." When the old woman heard this resolve, she was sorry for the young man, and taking a piece of bread from her pouch, she gave it to him, saying, "Take this bread and keep it safe as the apple of your eye." The prince took the bread and continued his journey. Very soon afterwards he met another old woman. She asked him where he was going. He told her he was going to demand the girl who lived in the doorless house on the mountain. Then the old woman tried to dissuade him, telling him just the same things as the former one had done. He said, however, "That may be quite true. Nevertheless, I will go, even if I never return." Then the old woman gave the prince a little nut, saying, "Keep this nut always by you. It may help you some time or another." The prince took the nut and went on his way till he came to where an old woman was sitting by the roadside. She asked him, "Where are you going?" Then he told her he was going on to demand the girl who lived in the house on the mountain before him. Upon this the old woman wept and prayed to him to give up all thoughts of the girl, and she gave him the very same warnings the old woman had done before. All this, however, was of no use. The prince was resolved to go on, so the old woman gave him a walnut, saying, "Take this walnut and keep it carefully until you want it." He wondered at these presents, and asked her to tell him why the first old woman had given him a piece of bread, the second a nut, and she herself now a walnut. The old woman answered, "The bread is to throw to the beasts before the house, that they may not eat you. And when you find yourself in the greatest danger, ask counsel, first from the nut, then from the walnut." Then the king's son continued his wandering till he came at last to a thick forest, in the midst of which he saw a house with only a single window. When he came near it, he was attacked by a multitude of beasts of all kinds, and, following the advice of the old woman, he threw a bit of bread towards them. Then the beasts came and smelt at the bread one after the other, and upon doing so, each drew their tail between their legs and lay down quietly. And is that not a beautiful picture? There are so many pictures in this book that I just want to frame and put on my wall. And this is amongst them. The house had no door but one window, which was very high above the ground, so high that do what he could, he was not able to reach it. Suddenly he saw a woman letting down her golden hair, so he rushed and caught hold of it, and she drew him up thereby into the house. That should sound familiar. Then he saw that the woman was she for whose sake he had come to this place. The prince and the girl were equally pleased to see each other, and she said, "Thank God that my mother happened to be from home. She has gone into the forest to gather the plants, by the aid of which she transforms into beasts all the young men who venture here and ask me to be their wife. Those are the beasts who would have killed you if God had not helped you. But let us fly away from this place." So they fled back through the forest as quickly as they could, and as they happened to look back, however, they saw the girl's mother was pursuing them, and they became frightened. The old woman was already very near them before the prince remembered his nut. He took it out quickly and asked, "For God's sake, tell me what to do now!" The nut replied, "Open me." The prince opened it, and from the little nut flowed out a large river which stopped the way, so that for a time the girl's mother could not pass. However, she touched the waters with her staff, and they immediately divided and left her a dry path, so that she could run on quickly after the prince and the girl. When the prince saw she could come up with them, he took out the walnut and asked, "Tell me, what must we do now?" And the walnut replied, "Break me." The king's son broke the walnut, and a great fire flamed out from it, so great a fire that the whole forest barely escaped being consumed by it. But the girl's mother spat on the fire, and it extinguished itself in a moment. Then the king's son saw that there were nothing but the jugglings of devils. So he turned eastward and made the sign of the cross and called on the mighty God to help him. Then it suddenly thundered and lightened, and from heaven flashed a thunderbolt, which struck the mother of the girl, and she fell dead upon the ground. Thus at length the king's son arrived safely at home, and when the girl had been made a Christian, he married her. Big Drew says, moral of the story, don't talk to or take trinkets or food from random old women. I mean, that's sort of the moral, yeah, sure. I think the real moral of the story is basically don't trust in soothsaying and such, which is a fairly standard Christian message. But yeah, I mean, whether that's the original ending, this is kind of why I opened how I did or not, is hard to say. There aren't really a lot of collections I could find of any Serbian folktales. This just happened to pop up last week on Project Gutenberg. It's not a place that is easy to find at least English translated stuff on. So unlike Grimm's fairy tales, where you have like footnotes and so on about different endings, I don't really know if that's the case for these. I have my suspicions that this is probably an altered ending when the culture turned more back to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And maybe at a certain time was not that way, because that meshes with how other fairy tales went through history and given the time that it's written. Now, do I know that? Not at all. Those are just sort of guesses. It very well could be the original ending. Big Drew says, Serbian Rapunzel. Yes, it is. And I think, I'm sure this is getting old for other people, but for myself, it's utterly fascinating to see the same structures of stories where you can sort of see the ghostly shape of it. You're like, that is definitely a Rapunzel. But when you look at how much is different, you're like, it is also in no way like Rapunzel. Like, it has enough key features, and there's certain durable features in those stories that when you see different versions of it, you will see those same things occur. But it makes no mention of a tower. It just talks about a house with one window, right? The mother's there, though. But, it is interesting to see, and we were talking last week about how there's, like, Tir na Nog, the Irish legend, has a certain tale in there that is conceived of in almost exactly the same way as a completely separate Japanese folktale, which is incredibly bizarre for the time that the book was released by Yeats, because at that point Japan was basically culturally isolated from all but very, very limited sources. on purpose. That was a function of the emperor at the time. So, like, it's incredibly strange when you see these things occur across cultures that really shouldn't have anything in common. But it is fascinating to see it occur across multiple areas of Europe and how different places conceive of it differently. Yeah, GS says, beware of mothers-in-law. That is the overriding theme in all of Europe. I don't know what the background is on that, but mothers-in-law being horrible, vain, and narcissistic people is like the canon. And it's weird because you would say, okay, these are all patriarchal cultures, so I can understand why a lot of blame and menace goes on women, but it's not mothers. It's on the mother that, like, a man would have chosen later. And it's weird to me because I don't think that's a particularly... I can't see how, like, a patriarchy would want to criticize that choice. So, like, it's strange to me. I don't know why that is so standard, the mother-in-law thing. Whether it's just there was one or two really notable queens that came along after one died in childbirth that were just basically gold diggers. Like, I think that might be part of what motivates it. Anyways, we have one more tale to read. This one is the most thorough of a story. It develops its characters the most. It still has a bit of a strange and abrupt ending. However, I particularly enjoy it. And if you've watched this consistently, you might know that I put the things that are like most recognizable and probably most likely to draw in people first. But I'm sure regular viewers can tell you those are usually not the best of the stories. And the best stories I put at the end because they're usually a bit longer and a little bit slower to get going. And so, I don't want to lose people if I can avoid that. So if you're still here, then you know that usually the last story is the most satisfying and full as a story. And that is the case here with Good Deeds Are Never Lost. Okay. This is called Good Deeds Are Never Lost. And it's from Serbian Fairytales. In days gone by there lived a married couple who had only one son. When he grew up, they made him learn something which would be of use to him in afterlife. He was a kind, quiet boy and feared God greatly. After his schooling was finished, his father gave him a ship, freighted with various sorts of merchandise, so that he might go and trade about the world and grow rich, help his parents in their old age. The son put to sea, and one day the ship he was in met with a Turkish vessel in which he heard... in which he heard great weeping and wailing. So he demanded of the Turkish sailors, "Pray tell me, why there is so much wailing on board your ship?" They answered, "We are carrying slaves, which we have captured in different countries, and those who are chained are weeping." Then he said, "Please, brothers, ask your captain if he would give me the slaves for ready cash." The captain gladly agreed to the proposal, but after much bargaining, the young man gave to the captain his vessel full of merchandise and received in exchange the ship full of slaves. Then he called the slaves before him and demanded of each whence he came, and told them all they were free to return to their own countries. At last he came to an old woman who held close to her side a very beautiful girl, and he asked them from what country they came. The old woman told him, weeping, that they had come from a very distant land, saying, "This young girl is the only daughter of the king, and I am her nurse, and have taken care of her from childhood. One day, unhappily, she went for a walk in the garden far away from the palace, and those wicked Turks saw her and caught her. Luckily, I happened to be near, and hearing her scream, ran to her help. And so the Turks caught me too, and brought us both on board of this ship. Then the old woman and the beautiful girl, being so far from their own country, and having no means of getting there, begged him that he would take them with him. So he married the girl, and took her with him, and returned home. One moment. When he arrived, his father asked him about his ship and merchandise, and he told them what had happened, how he had given his vessel with its cargo, and had bought slaves that he then set free. "This girl," continued he, "is a king's daughter, and the old woman her nurse. So they could not get back to their country. They prayed to remain with me, so I married the girl." Thereupon the father was very angry and said, "My foolish son, what have you done? Why have you made away with my property without cause and of your own will?" And he drove him out of the house. Then the son lived with his wife and her old nurse a long time in the same village, trying always, through the good offices of his mother and other friends, to obtain his father's forgiveness, begging him to let him have a second ship full of merchandise, promised to be wiser in the future. After some time, the father took pity on him and received him again into his house with his wife and her old nurse. Shortly after, he fitted him out another ship, larger than the first one, and filled with more valuable merchandise. In this he sailed, leaving his wife and her nurse in the house of his parents. He came one day to a city where he found the soldiers very busy carrying some unlucky villagers away to prison. So he asked them, "Why are you doing this, my brethren? Why are you driving these poor people to prison?" And the soldiers answered, "They have not paid the king's taxes. That's why we take them to prison." Then he went to the magistrate and asked, "Please tell me how much these poor prisoners owe." When the magistrate told him, he sold his goods and ships, and paid the debts of all the prisoners, and returned home without anything. Falling at the feet of his father, he told him what he had done and begged him to forgive him, but the father was exceedingly angry, more so than before, and drove him away from his presence. What could the unhappy son do in this great strait? How could he go begging, he whose parents were so rich? After some time, his friends again prevailed upon the father to receive him back, because, they urged, so much suffering made him wiser. At last the father yielded, took him again into his house, and prepared a ship for him, finer and richer than the two former ones. Then the son had the portrait of his wife painted on the helm, and that of the old nurse on the stern, and after taking leave of his father and mother and wife, he sailed away for the third time. After sailing for some days, he came near a large city in which there lived a king, and dropping anchor, he fired a salute to the city. And all the citizens wondered, as did also their king, and no one could say who the captain of the strange ship might be. In the afternoon, the king sent one of his ministers to ask who he was and why he came. And the minister brought a message that the king himself would come at 9 o'clock the next morning to see the ship. When the minister came, he saw on the helm the portrait of the king's daughter, and on the stern that of her old nurse. And in his surprise and joy dared not believe his own eyes, for the princess had been promised to him in marriage while she was yet a child, and long before she was captured by the Turks. But the minister did not tell anyone what he had seen. Next morning, at 9 o'clock, the king came with his ministers on board the ship, and asked the captain who he was and whence he came. Whilst walking about the vessel, he saw there the portrait of a girl on the helm and that of the old woman on the stern, and recognized the features of his own daughter and her old nurse who had been captured by the Turks. But his joy was so great he dared not believe his eyes, so he invited the captain to come that afternoon to his palace to relate his adventures, hoping thus to find out if his hopes were well founded. In the afternoon, in obedience to the king's wish, he went to the palace, and the king at once began to inquire why the figure of the girl was painted on the helm and that of the old woman on the stern. The captain guessed at once that this king must be his wife's father, so he told him everything that had happened, how he'd met the Turkish ship filled with slaves and had ransomed them and set them free. This girl alone, he continued, with her old nurse, had nowhere to go, as her country was so far off, so they asked to remain with me, and I married the girl. When the king heard this, he exclaimed, "That girl is my only child, and the accursed Turks took her and her old nurse. You, since you are her husband, will be the heir to my crown. But go at once to your home and bring your wife, that I may see her, my only daughter, before I die. Bring your father, your mother, bring all your family. Let your property be all sold in that country. Come all of you here. Your father shall be my brother, and your mother my sister, as you are my son and the heir to my crown. We will all live together here in one palace." Then he called the queen and all his ministers, and told them all about his daughter, and there was great rejoicing and festivity in the whole court. After this, the king gave his son-in-law his own large ship to bring back the princess and the whole family. So the captain left his own ship there, but he asked the king to send one of his ministers with him, "lest they should not believe me," he said. The king gave him as a companion for his voyage the same minister to whom he had formerly promised the princess in marriage. They arrived safely in port, and the captain's father was surprised to see his son return so soon and with such a splendid vessel. Then he told all that had happened, and his mother and wife, especially the old nurse, rejoiced greatly when they heard the good news. And as the king's minister was there to witness the truth of this strange news, no one could doubt it. That's a weird one to me. Seems like you could still doubt it. Could just be anybody. So the father and mother consented to sell all their property and go to live in the king's palace. But the minister resolved to kill this new heir to the king and husband of the princess, who he had been promised to him for his wife. And so, when they sailed a long distance, he called him on deck to confer with him. The captain had a quiet conscience and did not suspect any evil. So he came up at once, and the minister caught him quickly and threw him overboard. The ship was sailing fast, but it was rather dark, so the captain could not overtake her, but was left behind in the deep waters. The minister, however, went quietly to sleep. Fortunately, the waves carried the king's young heir to a rock near the shore. It was, however, a desert country, and no one was near to help him. Those he had left on board the ship, seeing next morning that he had disappeared, began to weep and wail, thinking he'd fallen overboard in the night and been drowned. His wife especially lamented him, because they had loved each other very much. When the ship arrived at the king's city, bringing news of the disaster, the king was troubled, and the whole court mourned greatly. The king kept the parents and the family of the young man by him, as he had engaged to do, but they could not console themselves for their great loss. This is, hands down, my favorite art we've ever had in one of these books. I love this. It is so beautiful, so beautifully painted. The colors are so gorgeous, and the posing and just mystery of it is marvelous. It's like a Ghibli painting, which is also in watercolor, so that could be why a background. I love this. Meanwhile, the king's unhappy son-in-law sat on the rock and lived on the moss which grew there, and was scorched by the hot sun, from which he had no shelter. His garments were soiled and torn, and no one would have recognized him. Still, not a living soul was to be seen anywhere to help him. At last, after 15 days and 15 nights, he noticed an old man on the shore, leaning on a staff, and engaged in fishing. Then the king's heir shouted to the old man and begged him to help him off the rock. The old fisherman consented.
"If you will pay me for it," said he.
"How can I pay you? As you see, I have nothing. Even my clothes are only rags," answered the young man sadly.
"Oh, that matters nothing," exclaimed the old man. "I have here a pen and a paper, so if you know how to use them, write a promise to give me half of everything you may ever possess, then sign the paper."
To that the young man gladly consented. So the old man walked through the water to him, and he signed the paper. Then the old man took him over to the shore, and after that he journeyed from village to village, barefoot, hungry, and sorrowful, and begged some garments to cover him. After 30 days wandering, his good luck led him to the city of the king, and he went and sat at the door of the palace, wearing on his finger his wedding ring, on which were his own name and the name of his wife. At eventide, the king's servants took him into the courtyard and gave him to eat what remained of their supper. Next morning he took his stand by the garden door, but the gardener came and drove him away, saying that the king and his family were soon coming that way. So he moved away a little and sat down near a corner of the garden. And shortly afterwards he saw the king walking with his mother, his father leading the queen, and his wife walking with the minister, his great enemy. He did not yet desire to show himself to them, but as they passed near him and gave him alms, his wife saw the wedding ring on a finger of the hand which he held out to take the money. Still, she could not think the beggar could be her husband, so she said, "Let me see the ring you have on your finger." The minister was walking by her, was a little frightened, and said,
"Go on. How can you speak to that ragged beggar?"
But she would not hear him. She took the ring and read thereon her own and her husband's name. Her heart was greatly troubled by the sight of the rings, but she controlled her feelings and said nothing. As soon as they returned to the palace, she told the king, her father, that she had recognized her husband's ring on the hand of the beggar who sat by the side of the garden. "So please send for him," said she, "that we may find out how the ring came into his hands." Then the king sent his servants to find the beggar, and they brought him to the palace. The king asked him whence he came and how he got that ring. Then he could no longer restrain himself, but told them how he'd been thrown overboard by the treacherous minister, and spent 15 days and nights on the naked rock, and how he had been saved. "You see now how God and my right dealing have brought me back to my parents and my wife." When they heard that, they could hardly speak, so rejoiced were they. Then the king summoned the father and mother and related what had happened to their son. The servants quickly brought him fine new garments and bathed and clothed him. Then for many days there were great rejoicings, not only in the palace but also in all the city, and he was crowned as king. The minister was seized by the king's order and given up to the king's son-in-law, so that he might punish him after his own will. But the young king would not permit him to be put to death. He forgave him on condition that he left the kingdom instantly. A few days after the old man had saved the young king came, bringing with him his written promise. The old man who had saved the young king came. The young king took the paper and reading it said, "My old man, sit down. Today I am king, but if I were a beggar I would fulfill my word and acknowledge my signature. Therefore we will divide all that I have." So he took out the book and began to divide the cities. "This is for me, this is for you." So saying, he wrote all on a chart till all was divided between them, from the greatest city to the poorest barrack. The old man accepted his half, but immediately made a present of it again to the young king, saying, "Take it. I am not an old man, but an angel from God.
I was sent by God to save thee for the sake of thy good deeds. Now reign and be happy, and may thy prosperity last long." The angel disappeared, and the king reigned there in great happiness. All right. The first thing I see looking over to the chat is Minister Butthead, which is fantastic. Oh, everyone called the double cross. Yeah, can't pull anything over you. Very pretty painting. Yeah. Yeah. I enjoyed that story. I do find the ending to be a little abrupt, but I guess what do you expect? It's weird, the little things that stand out to me, like the fact that the whole city rejoiced that he came in. City doesn't know him. Like, this guy showed up a day, disappeared for a month and a half, shows up again and becomes king for like a week, and they're like, oh my god. But yeah, I mean, it's a really nice tale, a surprisingly progressive sort of view of morality and politics and so on, about keeping your word and being true, and most of all that inarguably slavery is a wicked thing, which wasn't quite settled at that point in history. It was definitely closer to settled, but not entirely. I think it's obvious now, but it wouldn't have been as obvious then. So I really enjoyed that story. Hopefully you guys liked it as well. I'm going to go back to that painting because it is just gorgeous. Big Drew liked it. Well, that's all that matters, right? As long as I'm getting my the more talkative of my what's the word I'm looking for here? The more talkative of my Russian spam happy, then things are good. Okay, well, those are some Serbian folktales. Like all folktales, they have a lot of, and fairy tales, they have a lot of similarities to other stuff, other folktales and fairy tales, and they also have their own distinct flair and style. Hopefully you enjoyed it. We'll be back next week with more stories of a sort. We'll see what we like and what we enjoy. As far as Thursday at 6:30 p.m., that's when we do the Varietal show. That's a little more silly and higher energy. That's where we write stories together. And Big Drew says here, idea for Thursday, write a story with a wide array of words that make people uncomfortable. Examples of such words include moist, obelisk, loin, junket, and secretions. I would want to do that with somebody. Maybe I could see if I could drag up Felix, or probably Avalon would have fun with that. I'll see if I can drag them up to do that. What I'm currently planning to do, if the technology can hold up for it, and I always like to tell my Tuesday night crowd that waits around this long about it, what I currently am planning on doing is I found a God simulator where you get to put stuff into a world. It's sort of a kind of a computer game. You get to put stuff in a world, and then it has its own AI and does stuff, which is not terribly unique. But this one is really quite interesting because it gives you things. Well, it gives you things like dragons and necromancers and stuff that you can drop in the world. And so what I was thinking we could do is we could sort of, as a chat, set up a world, speed up the time, and what events occur, we can kind of pause it and write the lore of our world. Like reinterpret something that occurs with the AI in the game, because they go to war with each other and whatever else, and then write it like a lore master might of that world. So if the dragon comes in and burns out a city, then it'll be the great attack of the beast from the sky, and we can write that way. So that's my current plan. Everything is subject to change because, frankly, this is a jalopy of a production with little planning and very little polish, which is why you come here to Varietal Literature.
anyways, thank you so much for everybody who stuck around, and for those who were here earlier, thank you so much for coming back to watch the rest. And yeah, I hope that you guys have a good night and you get a good sleep. I'll keep the fire burning, and you take care of yourself.